Hello and welcome to ACM's second learning webinar. This webinar builds on the success of our pilot in January, which has had over 800 live attendees and has over 1,700 total views to date. This webinar reflects ACM's deep commitment to lifelong learning. Our aim is to empower computing professionals and students who join ACM's worldwide community of 100,000 members. My name is Clifton. I'm an associate professor of computer science at Purdue University. I'll be serving as the moderator for today's webinar. ACM offers innovative educational and professional development resources that bolster skill sets and enhance career development opportunities. Our members are able to stay competitive in the dynamic computing world with a range of ACM Learning Center online resources at learning.acm.org. You can see some of the highlights on your screen. ACM recognizes the role of computing in driving the innovations that sustain competitiveness in a global environment. Together with timely computing information published by ACM, access to the ACM Digital Library, the world's most comprehensive database of computing literature, and international conferences that draw leading experts on a broad spectrum of computing topics, ACM enables its members to solve critical problems using new technology that enriches our lives and advances our society in the digital age. Today's presentation is Security, Computing in an Adversarial Environment by Carrie Gates of CA Labs. Before we get started, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping items. At the end of our presentation, we will have time for questions, and we hope you have several. Also watch for live poll questions during the presentation. Submit your answer by clicking on the Submit button. In the top right corner of the slide area on your screen, there is a green button that will allow you to enlarge the slides. You may also enlarge the slides at any time by dragging the corner of the slide window. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. You can minimize the slide area, Q&A, and bio screens using the buttons on the bottom panel. If you're experiencing problems with the program, please press the F5 key on your keyboard to refresh your console or close and relaunch the presentation. You can also visit the webcast help guide by clicking on the help widget below the slide window. Please disable pop-up blocking software so that you can receive and respond to the feedback form at the end of this presentation. To control volume, adjust the master volume on your computer. And finally, the session is being recorded and will be archived. It will be available for review within 48 hours at learning.acm.org/webinar/security. If you think of a question during the presentation, please type it into the Q&A box on the lower left of the presentation and click on the Submit button. You do not need to wait until the end of the presentation to begin submitting questions. Okay. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. We are honored to have presenting today Dr. Carrie Gates of CA Labs, the research arm of CA Technologies, a Fortune 500 security and systems management software development company. Dr. Gates is Senior Vice President and Director of Research, as well as a distinguished engineer at CA Technologies. She has opened new avenues for collaboration in the field of cybersecurity for CA Technologies by leveraging government programs that further research between CA Labs and academia. She has given over 20 invited talks internationally, authored more than 40 peer-reviewed publications related to information security, and co-authored an amendment on cloud security research for the America Competes Act. In October 2010, Dr. Gates was recognized for her work with a Woman of Influence Award from CSO Magazine. Carrie, we look forward to your presentation here today.
Thank you, Chris. And I'm going to start with a question for everyone. Why is it that makes security different from every other computer science discipline? Why is security different from machine learning, from graphics, operating systems, databases, human-computer interaction, any of these other fields? And what it is that we have to deal with the presence of an adversary. We have someone who is actually trying to impact us, trying to do something adversarial, trying to do something against what we are trying to achieve. And that's really what we're dealing with when we're talking about security. And so you end up, because you're dealing with an adversary, you end up thinking about things differently and noticing things differently. So I'll start with a few random questions in this area. And in this case, I'll focus on questions around cameras. Think back to the last time you went into a bank. How many cameras were there? Did you notice? Did you count them? Where were they placed? Where have you started seeing cameras besides obvious places like banks? And I'll take a step back here and note that some of these questions are going to be a bit North American-centric. So, for example, when I think of seeing cameras in North America, I'm starting to see them in restaurants, for example. When I was in Israel, for example, when I went to a grocery store, I had a guard there search my bag to make sure everything was okay before I was allowed into the grocery store. So different locations have a very different notion of security. But in the North American context here, where is it here that we started seeing cameras? I went to fly on Delta at one point, and I went to the kiosk. It was an international flight, and they had a kiosk where I could get my boarding pass, and I had a camera on it. If I put my coat over the top of the kiosk and I just leave the arm hanging down so it blocks the camera, what happens when I try to check in for that flight? Or you're at a bank machine. Where can you stand to get cash out of the bank machine so that the camera on the bank machine does not get a picture of you? So that's looking at questions with a camera. What if we start looking at some of the other questions? What ID, say you have your car in to be serviced. What ID do you need to pick up your car, or even just your dry cleaning? And I bring that up as an example. There's one case where someone went in, they had their car serviced. When they went in to pick it up, all they had to do was say, oh, my name is so-and-so, and they could pick up their car. No ID check. What do you need to pick up a FedEx parcel held at the front office of your apartment complex? I had this experience a couple of days ago. I went to the front office. There was someone there who didn't know me. All she needed was my apartment number, and I was able to get the FedEx box. Can you get through TSA without an ID? So TSA here is the Transportation Security Administration, and that in the United States is who we need to go through for security checks before we're allowed to board an airplane. They're supposed to check both your ID and your boarding pass. Is it possible to get through there without an ID? And I'll give you a hint. The answer is yes. I know someone who did this within the past year by essentially social engineering her way through. A bit more tongue-in-cheek, how close can you get to the President of the United States at an APEC 2007 summit by pretending that you're Canadian? And I say this is a bit tongue-in-cheek. You can go to this YouTube link, go about 1 minute and 45 seconds in to start where this really starts happening. And this is a comedy show, The Chasers' War on Everything. And what happened here was they decided to try to get close to the President of the United States at the summit, which is being held in Sydney, Australia. And they did this by having a couple of different cars. They had black cars, the dark windows, a couple of people running alongside of the car, and a Canadian flag on it. And they were able to get by 2 security checkpoints. And within, I think it was 10 meters of the hotel where the George Bush, then President of the U.S., was staying. So it's very interesting to watch that they're able to do this. Can I make someone with a pacemaker have a heart attack? And that sounds a little, what's the right word there? Like I'm making something very, very big out of something, but it is an interesting question because a lot of different medical devices now have wireless controls. A pacemaker, for example, a doctor wants to wirelessly upload all of the data to see how your heart is doing. He might need to make a change in something, and he needs to wirelessly then have that change go back to the pacemaker. Yoshi Kono at University of Washington is doing research in this area, not just with medical devices, but actually any kind of device. So, for example, in a car, is there some way you can wirelessly affect someone's car while they're driving it and make some change? So, for example, they can't use the brake; it no longer works. So, very interesting research there. Another place to look: Avi Rubin did a TED Talk. So, TED, TED. Ideas Worth Sharing is the name of it. It's a very interesting 15-minute presentation. He did a presentation looking at security of medical devices. So that's another place to go look. Continue with just a couple of more questions in this vein. And I'm sorry, I seem to have looped. Can I read someone's computer screen from just a reflection? So, for example, if someone has something reflective, say there is a teapot a metal teapot beside them and I'm some distance away, can I see what's on their screen by looking at just that reflection? And there's actually a paper that's looking at this called Tempest in a Teapot, Compromising Reflections Revisited by Bax out of Germany, where he looks at exactly this thing and how far away you can be and still actually see the reflection and make good information on it. Can I get into grad school without having the prerequisites? A friend of mine, Sandy Clark, gave a presentation at ShmooCon a couple of years ago about how is it that you can essentially hack your way into grad school. How can you get into a PhD program without at a very, very good school? What is the best and easiest way to do that? So these are all of these questions have something in common. What is that? Well, the big thing there, the thing they really have in common is a different way of thinking about things. How is it that I can get through some loop? Is there a loophole? Is there some way I can bend the rules? And it's what has been called the security mindset. How is it that how can you get around things? And my definition for security mindset is a way of looking at the world that makes you discover the holes first. When I go into something, I automatically look for what is it that people are watching, why is it that they're watching these things, how is it that I can do something I should not be allowed to do. Bruce Schneier had a slightly different definition. The security mindset involves thinking about how things can be made to fail. I think it's a little bit broader than that. You're not necessarily looking for just how things can be made to fail, but also how is it that you can use things in a way that they were not intended to be used. So we have a number of different ways that, given that people think about things in this way, what is it from a security perspective that we can start doing? How can we use this mindset? What is our toolkit, essentially? And the biggest way we start looking at things is something called CIA. It stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. They really are building blocks for how we build systems and what it is that we need to be able to do and achieve. Confidentiality, essentially, I want to be able to keep my secrets secret. I want to, and typically I use cryptography for something like this. How is it that I can keep my secrets, protect them in a way that no one else can see them? Integrity. I want to know that the data is what it is supposed to be. For example, imagine what would happen if I went and changed something small, for example, on someone's an Excel spreadsheet, something someone might not notice, but it could have a large impact later on. How is it that I can protect that data? Availability. I need to know that I can get access to data or systems or whatever I need anywhere at any time, that data, that system is available to me. Conversely, it shouldn't be available to someone that it shouldn't have access to it, so it still needs to keep that confidentiality. And if you want to know more about this, Computer Security, Art and Science is a book by Matt Bishop. Matt Bishop is fantastic for computer security. Highly recommend any of his work, actually, this book and anything else that he's written. And if you want to see the first chapter, which talks about this in the next couple of slides coming up, I've provided the link to go look at that. So what are the actual goals of security here? Why is it that we're doing what we're doing? Well, obviously, there's the idea of protection, both people and of assets. But beyond that, there's also assurance. You want to be able to assure other parties that, yes, systems are being protected. There's also this notion of trust. And this is a little bit getting into the society side of things, but people need to trust the systems that they're using. They need to trust when they're doing going to their bank. They need to trust their bank with their money. They need to trust if they're doing an online transaction. They need to trust that that's going to happen and it isn't going to cause something malicious or something bad to happen to them. So trust is a huge part of security. Legal compliance is another one. Legal compliance in this case, we're trying to assure that we're meeting the laws of our country. So for example, in the U.S. we have SOX and HIPAA and other laws that we need to comply with. And then there's this notion of governance. And governance to me is really interesting because here you're looking at governance across different borders. And these borders might be, for example, across different countries. So the laws that I need to pay attention to within the U.S. and say am completely protecting my data, if I then go and move that to, say, the U.K., different laws are in effect. And the protections I have in place might not be sufficient to meet the laws that are in this other location. And then how can I talk back and forth between the two locations while still meeting those legal requirements? So how is it that we can protect systems? Going with our toolkit, we need to see what we have to do, why we have to do it, how can we do it? And there are really three things that we use for this: authentication, authorization, and I've always called it audit, although lately I've seen a lot of people have started calling it accounting. Authentication is the idea of how do I authenticate that you really are who you claim to be. So typically, it's using passwords, it's using biometrics, it's using tokens. The passwords, it's sort of the most common one, but that doesn't really say that you are who you claim to be. All it's telling you is that that this person has the password. It's not necessarily that this person is a particular person. Biometrics are another interesting example. In this case, you really are getting down to, yes, this is the person they claim to be. For example, if they're using a fingerprint, but there are also ways to get around this. Minority Report, the movie, for example, had a good one where it was using someone else's eyes to be able to get into a system. So it's a bit graphic, but it is possible for biometrics even to be fooled. Authorization is another part of our toolkit. How is it that we can determine that, yes, you are allowed to actually access what it is you're accessing? So the access control part of it. How do we know that you have that right to see that? Excuse me. And then there's audit. Not only do you have to protect the information, but you have to be able to show that you've protected the information, or in the cases that you haven't, that something has happened, you need to be able to go back to the logs and determine what happens for forensic analysis and for intrusion detection. And the ultimate goal for all of this is accountability. You want to be able to say who has done what, when, and if they were actually allowed to do that. There's also this notion, too, if you're using security within an organization, what is it that the organization is trying to protect? And typically, they'll then put policies in place to protect their information. They'll do risk analysis to determine what are the threats that they're facing, and how is it that they can then protect themselves against these threats. So what are their risks, really, and then what policies need to be put in place? A quote here that I really like on this is, thing is that once the security mindset matures with experience, we know that it is possible for any system, regardless of physical location or vendors that supply software, to be compromised. The question the risk analyst must answer, however, is really what is probable. So, and I love this quote because it holds out the idea that there is no such thing as perfect security. So in everything that we're doing, we're trying to make security as good as it can be, and taking into account what are the risks that we're facing, what are the threats, and how is it that we can address the threats that cause the greatest risk to us. So I've mentioned through some of this, this idea of society. Trust, for example, was a big one for here. And there really is a number of ways that security interfaces with society. It's not just a technical problem. So for example, if we're looking at identity, identity is a huge concept right now, but what does it actually mean? So for example, who am I? Am I my PII, personally identifiable information, my name, my address, my social security number? Am I my genetics, my position at work, my hobbies? Is it that I'm a traveler? Am I serious? Am I a network engineer? What am I? What is my identity? And once you determine what is it that makes someone's identity, if you can make that determination, how do you know that you're giving, from a technical side, you're giving access now to the right person? How do you know if you want to give me something that it really is me that's receiving it? And that's really the root of the authentication problem. How is it that we have in our head this idea of what constitutes a person? We know when we see someone who they are. But when you translate that to a technical thing, how is it that you know that you're still dealing with the person that you want to be dealing with? And on top of that, there's this notion of continuous authentication. I've been working at my computer. I've authenticated. The computer, it feels, the account system, whatever, feels okay that I really am who I claim to be. I walk away. Someone else sits down and starts using my machine. They now have access to my email, my files. How is it that you can know that the person doing the work always is who they claim to be? More broadly, should there be a global identity? For example, again, a U.S.-based thing, NSTIC, National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. Really interesting documentativeness that is very interesting to read, looking at the idea of identity. And the question is, should your different identities be kept separate, or should there be one single identifier for you? And for example, let's think about Facebook. If you have a Facebook account, you're going to be friends with people that you're close to, and so you might be posting things that you want your close friends to see. Well, now you start having friends from work. Do you want to show them the same things that you show your close friends or your family? Do you have different identities or personas that you need to protect? And so does it make sense to have one single identifier? Do you want to be able to have multiple identities? And then take this a little bit further. Anonymity. Should anonymity exist? Should we be able to provide that functionality? And I've often heard the case where, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, you shouldn't care that someone can see that it's you doing something, and you shouldn't care that this information is available. But there really are times where anonymity might be something that you consider valuable, even if someone else at that same time does not. I'll give you an example of whistleblowers or dissidents, Arab Spring, for example. In some cases, there are some factions that think that people should not have been, the people should have been anonymous, and other people who think that the identity should have been available. It really depends on perspective at this point. So how is it from a security point of view that you provide the right, what is actually needed, and whose perspective do you take? How do you design systems to deal with these different competing needs? Pseudonymity is another example. An Identity Woman, if you go to the link there, she has some really, and her pseudonym is Identity Woman, but she has some very interesting thoughts on identity and what's required. And then there's also the social notion of trust. I trust someone because I know them. When I see them, I know who they are, and I have some relationship with them. That means that I now trust them. So trust has been defined in the dictionary as reliance on the integrity, strength, ability, surety, etc. of a person or thing, confidence. And you really need to have this notion in security systems. And I've heard it argued from security professionals that trust is a vague notion and it should not actually have anything to do with security. But that's actually from a technical point of view, in my perspective. You're right. When you're designing something, you should not, as a security person, you should have absolutely no trust in the underlying system, in your developers, in how it's going to be deployed, in anyone that you're working with. But at the same time, the security systems are there for society, and society needs to have trust in the systems, or else they're just not going to work. It's not going. They're not going to actually use the system. So, for example, they won't use online banking unless they trust the security that is there. And so we really need to pay attention to these social notions of trust and to keep them in terms of a technology context. Some of the other ways that social notions as well come into looking at usability of systems. So from an end user, there's a lot of usability questions when it comes to security. So take, for example, how many passwords do you have? Can you even, I know if I had to go off the top of my head, I couldn't even begin to guess how many different passwords I have, how many different systems I have access to. So how do you start remembering all of your passwords? And then you also encounter cases where your password must be 3,732 characters long and contain at least one uppercase letter, one lowercase letter, one digit, and one special character. How is it that you can remember your passwords that are being designed this way so that they have increased strength, but now you're hitting a usability issue? Maybe you start writing down your passwords. Well, okay, then you forget the password to the file where you keep all your passwords. So how is it that you can have a system that is both usable and secure at the same time? Other end user questions. How do I know I'm secure when I'm online? What does this error message mean? So these are things that we need to deal with from an end user. And people have started dealing with this. So for example, in passwords, there's this notion of graphical passwords you'll see in the literature. And so you might have an image, and someone will click some number of points on the image, and that will be their password. And all they have to remember next time they come back, they get the same image, and they just have to say, okay, it's these points. So if you look at this image and try to design a graphical password, what points would you click on? Well, how many of you are going to choose those sort of beige pieces that are jutting out on the side of the image, on the left-hand side of the image? Or you might go for the top of the umbrellas in the back, or maybe the top of the palm tree. People tend to actually choose the same points in the image, and so it actually decreases the security of the image because it makes the password more guessable while at the same time making it more usable. And so you need to have this balance. Next question, am I secure online? So if you go to a bank, how do you know that you're secure? Well, they provided this handy little lock on the screen to show you that you're secure. Well, at the same time, there's also a lock down at the bottom of your browser. There's another lock that's up by the URL. So which lock do you trust? Does the lock on the actual screen mean that you're secure? Well, anyone can put up a screen that has a lock beside it. It doesn't actually tell you anything. So which one do you believe? How do you know that you're actually secure? And then there are error messages. What does it mean to say that you have an invalid security certificate? What does it mean that it's self-signed? Why is that bad? So how is it that we can present this information to users in a way that makes sense? What is it that they really want to know? Well, what it is that they want to know out of all of this is that they are safe. That's what it comes down to. I'm about to do something. Am I safe when I'm doing this? What is the probability that something bad is going to happen to me? So they don't actually care that the security certificate is invalid. What they want to know is if they go to this site, what is the probability something bad will happen to them? And then based on that probability, they can say, okay, yes, I'm still going to go there. I'm going to take that risk, or decide not to. But we need to start making things that are usable in this sense. That's from the end user perspective. Well, there's also the usability of the security software itself. So for example, say you're an enterprise, and I'm going to take a very simple example. I'm sitting at the border of my network, and I'm watching the traffic, and I'm watching just high-level net flow traffic. What I'm seeing then is traffic going from one IP to another IP in particular ports, the time, what time it's going, and how large it is. How is it that I can see, and I have millions of these going by a day, maybe even billions. How can I tell embedded in there that something bad is happening? All right, well, one way to look at it is to maybe visualize it. What is it that it looks like if I start visualizing it? So I might have this pattern showing the connections between one machine and another bunch of machines in my network. Does this show that something good is happening, something bad is happening? Say I have a lot of machines now. Then I have a whole bunch of traffic. How can I tell what in here is good and what is bad? And this is something Greg Conti, for example, has looked at. He has a paper from Soups on this. How you can embed bad traffic in such a way that no one sees it because it's overwhelmed with all of the good traffic and just keeps it hidden. And this is a very, very simple example. I'm just looking at traffic crossing my border. If you start adding in all the other aspects that you should be looking at, so things like who's logging into the systems, when is it they're logging in, what is it that they're doing, or is what they're doing something that meets policy or violates policy? Is it something that's going to be malicious to the company or not? There's a huge amount of complexity that we're dealing with here in trying to analyze all of this information and determine what's happening. So that's just looking at from the system software perspective. An organization also cares about their security, and they look at it from a policy perspective. So quick poll question for you. Do you know all of the security policies for your organization? And I probably should have underlined or highlighted the word all there. So chances are you know at least some of them, possibly most of them? Do you know all of them? For example, you find a USB key laying on the conference room table. What do you do? Is there a policy that says what you're supposed to do with that USB key? Dropbox. Maybe you want to use Dropbox to be able to get some files from your laptop to your iPad easily, so you can just take your iPad with you while you go on a trip. Are you allowed to use Dropbox? So do you actually know what all of these policies are? So I'm going to try pushing results. There you can see majority of you say that you don't know all of the policies, and I would agree that you don't know that. In the majority of cases, most people do not know all of the security policies for their organization. Here's an even more interesting question for you. For all the ones that you do know, do you adhere to all of them? And to me, I find this a really interesting question because there are times when you're looking at things going, so the Dropbox example, I want to be able to do my job. So I need to be able to use Dropbox to be able to get the files to a place where I need them. But if that goes against security policy, what do I do? Do I actually not use Dropbox and not do my job? Or do I still use it and go forward? So I'm curious for the audience. And pushing the results out, roughly 50-50. Half of you do adhere to all the policies that you know, and roughly half of you don't. And I would say that's probably about right. I wasn't sure what I was going to get for an answer to this, and I thought if most of you said yes, I wouldn't actually believe you. And the reason is that we really do want to get our jobs done. And oftentimes, security is the enemy of what we're trying to do. Security is viewed as the enemy because it's keeping you from doing your jobs. For example, Angela Safi out of University College of London has some fantastic work in this area, which will go into an organization, and they might have 100 pages worth of security policies. Well, no one's going to adhere to all of that because no one's even going to know what all of them are. So how is it that you can come down to what are your core policies that really protect your organization and keep it to that set, and at the same time have a balance so people can get their jobs done? An example policy might be that you have a USB key. Are you allowed to, you're going to put information on that to take it outside of the company. That's fine. But it needs to be encrypted. Do you always encrypt it? Well, if you're a salesperson, maybe you're not encrypting it because you have to give a major presentation tomorrow. It's a big sales opportunity. And so you're worried that if you encrypt it, you might not be able to decrypt it and then show it to the person that you're working with. So there are often times where it's more important to get your job done than it is necessarily in the mind of the person doing this to secure that information. And so organizations need to walk that line in terms of policies. So I'm going to take you through with a quick example now that I've covered some of the social side of what's happening with security and some of the technical side. I'm going to go through a quick example of insider threat and I'll start with talking about from the technical side of things, and then I'll move back into doing the social side of things again. So looking at some insider threat examples, there are really three places that three types of threats occur. One is intentional data leaks. And an example here for a malicious data leak, it's Robert Hansen, who was an FBI agent who was arrested. There's actually a movie about him, I believe it's called Breach, looking at what he was doing and then how he was actually eventually caught. There might be non-malicious intentional data leaks as well. So for example, there were employees who looked at Obama's cell phone records. They weren't doing this to do something against their company. They were just curious, but it was still doing something that was a data leak, and it was intentional. And so how is it that you do a balance there in terms of protecting yourself as an organization? Sabotage of company resources is a second threat from an insider. And an example here is that an IRS subcontractor who inserted code on agency servers to delete data. And this is not typically not too uncommon, actually, where people will put code on a system and say, if anything happens to me, it's almost like a way of getting back at the organization. They can do something after they've been let go, for example, that will then impact the organization in a negative way. And then the third threat that organizations face from insiders is abuse of privileges. For example, a security supervisor at a UK bank let in 2 hackers to then try to steal a very large sum of money. Another example is someone who stole employee passwords. So people who legitimately have access to things who then abuse that access, abuse that privilege in order to do something that they're not supposed to do. So those are just a couple of examples of insiders and attacks. So really, what is an insider? What forms an insider? And typically when we've looked at an organization, we've thought of an organization as being a fortress. Anyone who is inside the fortress is an insider. Anyone who is outside the fortress is an outsider. Except if we start looking at today's computer systems, it's a little more complex than that. So for example, we need to deal with people who are working from home. How is it that we provide access to them? We also need to deal with employees who are mobile, so they might be accessing the company resources from their iPhone, from their BlackBerry, from their iPad, from a laptop. We might also bring in consultants. We have other people who are coming into the company who are doing something on the company's behalf, but they're not actually employees of the company. Are they an insider? Outsourcing is another thing that happens. And so we're now taking assets of the company and we're trusting some other entity with those assets. And so it might be, for example, a lot of companies use Salesforce.com, and so they've outsourced the infrastructure for looking after all of their sales contacts to this separate organization. So they've outsourced that to this other organization. And then cloud is becoming larger and larger, and so much more of our company resources, company data is going out into the cloud. So given all of this, who are insiders, given that we don't have this notion really of a perimeter anymore? So I'll give you my definitions, at least, for what insiders are. In 2008, I decided that an insider is someone with respect to some resource or data. If you have legitimate access to some resource or some piece of data, then you are an insider with respect to that. So I'm taking away the notion of an organization and becoming much more granular. In 2010, I realized there's a little bit of a problem with that definition, and I changed to be an insider account with respect to that resource or data. This goes back to when I was talking about our authentication problem. It might be that I intend for Joe to have access to particular data, but I can't say that Joe has access. I can say that an account that only Joe should be accessing has access to that data. And then there's also, and then what I did is I modified it again, and I actually brought back this notion of a perimeter. And I've decided to define an insider based on what it is that you can monitor. And this has a number of implications for outsourcing, SaaS, cloud, and things like this. But if, for example, I'm using Salesforce.com, the system administrators there have access to the databases and to all the data in the databases. Therefore, they might have access to resources from my company. I can't monitor that, so yes, they might be insiders with respect to that data, but because I can't monitor it, I'm not going to worry about it. In that case, what I have are service level agreements with the other company, and they have to look after that aspect of my security for me. So when I've outsourced some of my data, at the same time, I have to also outsource some of my security. So there are really two types of insiders. There's masqueraders are one type. And what a masquerader is someone who's pretending to be someone else. So, for example, Joe has an account to do something. I borrowed Joe's account for some reason. I am now masquerading as him as far as the system is concerned. So you have one person who's trying to act like someone else. So then what is the goal of anything trying to detect this? Are you really trying to detect that there is a masquerader, that someone else is using an account, or are you just trying to detect that there's some attack happening? Because it might be Joe gave me access to his account because I needed to send an email off really quickly, and my computer was nowhere to be found, and I couldn't get access to my email system, and so I was just borrowing his email to send something off to my daughter to let her know I'll be late picking her up or something. It's not malicious. It probably almost definitely would go against policy. Is that something that you want to be able to detect or not? Or maybe I've gotten access to Joe's account and I am using it for a malicious purpose. What is it that you're really trying to detect here? And there's different ways to approach this. People have been looking at this. One way is to measure the behavior. So, for example, the commands that are being used. Is there some change that indicates that maybe someone else is doing something with an account? Is there something that makes it not normal for that user? And there's been work, Sal Stoffel from Columbia University and Roy Maxian from Carnegie Mellon University. Both have done some really interesting work in this area. And then sort of a bit of a tongue-in-cheek question here, but isn't a masquerader an insider? The second type of insider is a traitor. This is someone who has legitimate access. They might be working for your organization. They have some reason for being there. They have some reason for having this access, and now they intentionally do something that violates policy. And you have to be a little bit careful on this because, to go back to my other example of someone who has a USB key and they do not encrypt what's on it so that they can get their job done, so they don't have to worry about the presentation not being available. They have intentionally done something that violated policy. So the question then becomes why. In that case, it's not malicious. But what happens if they're doing a policy violation for some kind of malicious act? So they're planting a Trojan horse, so deleting files, or leaking data. They're doing some sort of abuse of privilege that has a malicious reason behind it. And so this is, to me, a really interesting kind of insider that we want to be able to detect. And the thing that makes them different, and the real problem here, is you're trying to infer their intent from their actions. Keep in mind, this is someone who has legitimate access to this. How can you tell that when they're accessing a file that the reason is to be able to complete some work-related task, or the reason for accessing that is to print it and give it to the competition? How do you know why they are doing something? So there are two real current approaches in industry, at least, looking at insider threat detection, and not so much detection as prevention. One is looking at data leak prevention, and the other are point solutions. In terms of data leak prevention, at the moment, in industry, we're geared much more actually towards unintentional loss of information. We're not there yet with being able to detect intentional removal of information for a malicious purpose. And there are also point solutions. In this case, they are more geared towards looking for something that's malicious that's happening, but it tends to be very specific. So credit card fraud detection, for example, is a good example here. But those algorithms cannot be taken out and applied to anything else other than credit card fraud detection. So they're very, very much point solutions. So in this case, detecting insiders is kind of like intrusion detection, except that it's not an intruder, it's someone who already has legitimate access. But the same basic rules apply in terms of trying to detect them. There are two ways to go about it. One is using signature-based detection algorithms, and the other is anomaly-based detection. In terms of signature-based detection, you want to look for known patterns that represent malicious activity. And so the question becomes, how do you develop realistic signatures in this case? And right now what we tend to see in the industry are things like there have been too many failed logins, or you're logging in at an unusual time. These are things that are relatively easy for an intelligent adversary or even a halfway intelligent adversary to be able to get around. So then you can start looking at things like anomaly-based detection. But here you have this assumption underlying anomaly-based detection is that there is a normal for each person and that normal can be modeled. So assuming that holds true, then the next assumption is that anything that attack activity will be anomalous, and that, conversely, anomalous activity is actually an attack. And so these assumptions do not necessarily hold true, and so it becomes a very, very difficult problem to solve. What makes insider threat detection even more interesting is data. So what do insiders look like? Well, they look like you and me. They act like you and me. So how is it that you know that all of a sudden they're not like you and me and they're doing something malicious? And there's not a lot of data out there right now on what insiders look like. And on top of that, there's not a lot of technical data in terms of what distinguishes them from non-threats. And what data do we need to collect even to detect an insider from the first place? And I'm sorry, tongue-in-cheek says anything, but if we can't collect everything, then where should we focus our efforts? And how is it that we can really detect that someone is doing something maliciously? we're also, when you're looking at insiders, it's also not like intrusion detection in the sense that we can also look at a lot more data. Intrusion detection, you're looking for an intruder. In this case, you can actually start adding in a lot more data, roles, identities, policies. So your data now is much richer, much more complex, and so you have a lot more to look at. And at the same time, you have someone who has legitimate access. They're not an intruder. They have legitimate access. So you're trying to determine why they're performing some particular action. And say you've come up with an algorithm that you think does work and does solve all these problems. How do you test it? Right? And how do you test this ethically? How do you happen to find an insider? Do you pay someone to be an insider and see if you detect them? How is it that you can test this in a realistic setting? So I'd also mention that there's a lot of social aspects to this. It's not just, I was just talking a lot from the technical side here, but also let's look at the social side. What is our identity in this case? Well, we have masquerader versus traitor, and actually this is masquerader versus traitor versus legitimate employee trying to get their job done. How is it that we can define which box actually someone fits in here? The notion of trust is huge in this case. How is it that you can detect an insider? Well, you need to collect data, and you need to be mining it, and you need to be watching for someone doing something malicious. Well, all right, who sees that data? What are the privacy issues in here? What about false positives? Imagine you accuse someone of doing something malicious, and they were really just trying to get their job done. What impact does that have on that person? And then that person's going to talk to their colleagues. So what impact does that really have on the organization as a whole? And how does this actually inspire loyalty in your employees? So there's a lot of trust issues going back and forth on both sides here that have to be addressed. How is it that you can detect someone's doing something malicious while at the same time actually respecting your employees? There's usability issues here, and not just the system that's using an insider threat detection system, but also all employees. If you're putting in extra security controls and measures, that's going to affect everyone and how it is that they can do their job. And then there's also the adoption of your security policies. So if you put in new policies, how much will people actually pay attention to them, and how often will they actually not pay attention to them, just trying to, again, get their job done? So there's a number of social side of things here. And it's because of that social side of things that really the best way to ultimately prevent insider attacks, and this is going to sound odd, but I actually completely believe it, happy employees. Has nothing to do with the technology side, but you're actually trying to solve the security aspect by looking at the social aspects of things. There's a nice study that was done by Frank Greitzer out of Pacific Northwest National Lab, which is the Department of Energy lab in the United States. And what he did is he looked at organizations where someone had been actually convicted of some sort of insider attack. And he talked to them and asked, how is it that, were there any signs ahead of time that showed that this person was about to do something malicious? And he found that there often were cases. And usually it was things like the person was suddenly becoming very unhappy with their job. Maybe they had been passed over for a promotion. And if people had been paying attention to the social side, that this person really wasn't happy anymore, was really upset with their organization, that maybe someone could have stepped in and then prevented the attack from happening by addressing the social side of things. And so that gives you a sort of a summary of just one aspect of a security problem, and the number of different ways that you need to actually look at this problem. So to give you a few conclusions by looking over all of these things, really to me there are 10, off the top of my head at least, 10 reasons why security is a special case. Number one reason, absolutely, there is an adversary. That is the biggest difference you're going to find between security and anything else. What that leads to is, number two, that the thought process around determining security is different from other fields because you have to take into account the fact that you have someone acting against you. The concepts that we deal with can be very difficult concepts. The question becomes, how can you teach them? To use an example, there's a paper called Why Johnny Can't Encrypt. That paper is over 10 years old now, and I think it's still relevant today. People still cannot really do good encryption. If they want to send email, they can't encrypt it. They don't know how. The notion of a public key and a private key does not intuitively make sense to someone. What is a public key? If it's public, there's no key to it. Security is often a feature. It's not the main functionality, and so it doesn't really get the same level of importance. There's a huge amount of complexity involved in security because you're dealing with an adversary. And this is at multiple levels. It can be at the end user level, it can be at the admin level, it can be at the organization. And on top of that, once you've detected something's happening, how do you know who is actually doing it? How do you actually get back to the individual? How do you have that level of accountability? On top of that, there's generally considered to be the trade-off between usability and security. People want to be able to get their jobs done. Security is often seen as the enemy that stops people. How do you test your security systems? If you have new algorithms, how do you test those? Because experimenting on users might not be considered the most ethical thing to do. For example, when people were testing spam and phishing and do people actually respond to these? Well, is it ethical to attack users with a phishing scam and see how they respond? And finally, trust is very important from society side. But how do you generate trust in your systems? And really, what the truth of all of this is, when you're looking at security, from the computer science side, security is an awful lot of fun, and we can do all kinds of wonderful things from it. But what it really comes down to is, how is it that people are most likely to break your system? What are the risks? What are the threats? And how is it that you can address those things and not worry about other threats that actually might exist but have a very small probability of happening? So that really, to me, is the truth of the matter. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over and see if there are any questions. Okay, and I haven't had a chance to read these ahead of time, so we'll see how good a job I do on answering them. So we have one question. What capabilities still need to be invented or substantially cost improved to more carefully implement your vision of complete security, and what security capabilities are fully understood such that there is no excuse for lack of implementation? Ouch. All right. So the idea of complete security, I don't believe in. There is no thing such as complete security or perfect security. So the question then becomes, what is the best security that you can have? Capabilities still to be invented or substantially cost improved. Continuous authentication would be a good one. Attribution would be another. How is it that you know who has actually performed some action? Is there some way to bridge that, basically that gap between the computer and the person? So those would be sort of the capabilities I would focus on. So hopefully that answers that.
Okay. Yeah, and Carrie, we actually have a number of good questions. I'd like to tell people to keep them coming in, and we will try to stay on and get to some of them even after the webinar ends, possibly making them available in the webinar announcing the online availability of the webinar. Okay, so here's a great question, Carrie. If there is one single thing that an average person can do to improve their security, what would it be?
Ooh, all right, the average person. So that's a really broad question. Are you talking about security in terms of the computer system? Are you talking about security in terms of their person? And it has different answers. In terms of just an absolutely average person, and this is going to sound so incredibly basic, but just keeping your antivirus up to date. If you're my parents, for example, their computer system, they don't understand even what antivirus is, so why is it that they should try keeping it up to date? And so it makes it easier for other people to actually access their system and use it for as a bot, for example. In this case, I'm not sure they care, to be honest, because no one's stealing their information. It's just that someone else is using their computer. If you talk about the security of the person, actually, and I forget the gentleman's name for this, but there's a movie based on him. He's the one from the late 1960s who, Catch Me If You Can, that's the name of the movie. I wish I could remember the gentleman's name that it's based on. But he gave a really interesting presentation where he was talking about using credit cards. If you're going to do transactions online, use your credit card instead of a debit card, and use your credit card instead of writing checks. And the reason is that your credit card has a $50 protection on it. You're only responsible for the first $50 if it's stolen. After that, the credit card company is responsible. That's not true of your personal checking account. And so if someone does something that takes out $500, if it's your checking account, you're owed $500. If it's a credit card, you're only owed $50. So that's another, but it's so, security covers so many things. So that's just the first two that come to the top of my head.
Okay. Yeah, we've got quite a number of others, and give Carrie time to read through them, some of these, but I'll bring one up right now. What about security on mobile platforms, such as tablets and smartphones?
And what about them? So there's actually been a lot of work that started happening, particularly on mobile phones, and particularly focusing on the Android platform because it's so much more open than any of the other mobile platforms right now. What's his name? University of Pennsylvania. Patrick Daniel is doing a lot of really good work in this area where they're looking at security there. And there's a number of areas that we really have to look at. One is, how do you sandbox your application so that one application doesn't have access to, say, the data in another application? Can I design an application that at the same time opens an internet connection and something that will allow me to record voice, and so that I can record what you're doing and then send it out? How is it that we can detect that this is happening and prevent it from happening? Is that something that should be built into the security of the platform? So there's a number of people who are start looking at how can we provide that kind of security in the mobile devices. I think that we're going to see a lot more security problems, a lot more malicious code on mobile devices as they become more ubiquitous.
Carrie, here's another good question. What are some weird security policies you've seen that have turned out to be detrimental to an organization?
Oh, that is a good question. Other than the one that I like using in the presentation about the encrypted USB key, actually Dropbox. Some organizations have a policy where you can't use Dropbox or anything like that. Well, at the same time, that keeps people, anything really that keeps people from being able to do their job, there has to be this balance between keeping data secure, but also allowing people to get their job done. What's the probability that someone's going to compromise my data on Dropbox? And then the question becomes, am I dealing with anything that's really confidential to the company? So if I have fourth quarter results that haven't been released yet and I'm putting those out on Dropbox, well, maybe I shouldn't be doing that because the data is so valuable. But if I'm just putting up a generic document, maybe it's a paper I'm working on writing, something like that, something that really does not really have a large amount of value to the company, then that should be fine. And so having this blanket policy that says, no, you can't do that, actually is detrimental in the long run. I wish I had a better example. That's just what's coming to my mind.
Okay, we've got, like I say, we have a lot of questions. I think we'll take one more, and then we're going to have to call it time. What capabilities still need to be invented or substantially cost improved to more fully implement your vision of complete security? And what security capabilities are fully understood such that there's no excuse for lack of implementation?
I like the idea of no excuse for lack of implementation. Cryptography is really, I'm not going to say fully understood because I'm not sure that it's necessarily even possible to fully understand or fully have it perfect. But it's at a point where it should be deployed much more than it is. So really we should be looking at the usability side of this and saying, why is it that we don't have this deployed more? And I know that there are issues with the big issue is being key management too as well. But it seems like we should be looking at that more and should be finding ways to solve that. I'm not sure that's a real cost reason for, or that there is no excuse for lack of implementation there. But I think that's one that I'm surprised isn't implemented more fully.
Okay, well, thank you, Carrie. We've run out of time today. This webinar will be available on demand at learning.acm.org/webinar/security. And don't forget to check out ACM's other great learning resources in the area of cybersecurity and beyond. In closing, I'd like to once again thank Dr. Gates for her informative presentation and insightful answers to the many questions. And a special thanks to our audience for taking the time to attend and participate today. Please take a moment to fill out our brief survey. And let me just get that survey up for you. And it should only take 2 to 3 minutes, and it will help us to improve your next webinar experience. Please check acm.org and learning.acm.org in the coming weeks for announcements on upcoming webinars. And for those of you who have a little bit more time, we're going to try to keep this open for a little bit longer and answer a few more questions, some individually, and as long as we can, some through the full webinar. And we'll also see if we can answer some of them in the email that will be coming out announcing that the webinar is available online. So anyway, Carrie, have you had a chance to look at any of the questions? We have many good questions. And so have you had a chance to look at any you'd like to pick up and answer now?
Well, I like the one that is, I am a student from Germany. I want to make my career in security. How can I start? Because this is actually a good one, not just for students looking to do a career there, but really for anyone. I mentioned Matt Bishop earlier. Do a Google search on him, and his webpage has a number of fantastic resources that start looking at security. And he has a very holistic view of it. And so what you'll find is a number of his resources don't look offhand like they have anything to do with security. So he might reference different Philip K. Dick novels, for example. But you read the novels and start thinking about it from the security context, you'll see that it has a lot of really interesting implications. He also has obviously very technical resources to post it. His book is fantastic. Another really awesome book is by Ross Anderson, Security Engineering. So the two of those are probably, in my opinion, two of the best books out there. How to get started? If there are courses, obviously, that you can take, that would be another good thing to do. Those are sort of the top 3 things that are coming to mind. Start experimenting. Set up a Linux box at home and start playing with different things and saying, how can I tighten this box? How do firewalls work? How do IP tables work? What happens if I have a small network? What is tripwire? How does that work? What about Snort or Bro as intrusion detection systems? What traffic am I seeing? Because you're going to see, if you start monitoring it, you're going to see a bunch of stuff coming at your machine. What is it? Why is this happening? So just start playing is another really great way to do things.
Okay. Do we have any other, Carrie, do you have time for any other questions here? And do you see any in the list that look pretty good?
All right, well, I'm going to go with the short ones because they're quicker to read, actually. Because I like the one, is game theory used in security today? And the answer is yes on the academic side. Not so much on the corporate side. And I've seen some use of it in the government side. So there is that balance. But certainly on the academic side, people start looking at game theory in terms of, because it is a game. You have 2 people who are competing against each other. And actually, a lot of things have been applied to security. Economics is another one that's really quite interesting. It's sort of along the same idea as game theory.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually, as far as research, if anybody wants to email me, clifton@cs.purdue.edu, I do a little work in that area. And I actually, a couple of my students and former students have done even more work in that area and can give you a lot of pointers to the research. But like I say, as far as practice, well, the security is one area where there is a bit of a gap between research and practice, unfortunately. And a lot of that, as one of our questions comes to do with usability, we've had several questions dealing with the trade-off between usability and security and what that means. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Carrie.
No, you're right. Security basically comes down to you want to provide the right information to the right people at the right time, and that's it. And it should be simple.
So, okay. Well, I would, like to thank our audience for taking the time to attend and participate today. And please look for the next ACM webinar, which will be coming up. If you go to that learning.acm.org/webinar site, you'll find more information. Thank you. And thank you, Carrie.
Thank you. Thank you.